contemplating deeply on the secret message of impermanence, what lies in fact beyond impermanence and death, leads directly to the heart of the ancient and powerful Tibetan teachings. These are the words Sogyal Rinpoche used to open his landmark book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. For millions of people, this book was nothing short of a revelation. It sold countless copies, was translated into over 30 languages, and brought the wisdom of Tibetan Buddhism into the homes of a global audience searching for answers. It offered comfort to the grieving, courage to the dying, and a compassionate guide to life for the living. The author, Sogyal Rinpoche, who could uniquely connect ancient wisdom with the modern world. He was friends with celebrities, a speaker at global conferences, and the head of Rigpa, a massive international network of over 100 Buddhist centers he had founded. But that wasn't the whole story. Not even close. Behind the public facade of the wise and benevolent teacher, a completely different reality was taking shape. For decades, inside the secret inner circles of his own organization, the man who wrote so beautifully about compassion was allegedly building a world based on cruelty, fear, and exploitation. As one survivor would later put it, his public face is one of wisdom, kindness, humor, warmth, and compassion, but his private behavior is deeply disturbing and unsettling. This is the story of a beloved spiritual master and the staggering hypocrisy he managed to hide. It's the story of the psychological systems that allowed abuse to thrive for nearly half a century, protected by the very faith of his followers. And most of all, it's the story of the courageous students who, after years of devotion and silence, risked absolutely everything to expose the dark truth. In his teachings, Sogyal Rinpoche often stressed the vital importance of devotion. He would quote one of his own masters, saying, "Devotion is the essence of the path." For so many of his followers, this was a sacred truth, but according to a letter from 8 of his most senior students, that devotion was rewarded with violence. They alleged, "Your physical abuse have left monks, nuns, and lay students of yours with bloody injuries and permanent scars." Millions of people found peace in the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, but for some of the people closest to him, the author was the source of their deepest pain. This is the story of how they risked everything they had to bring that truth to light. To really get how deep the betrayal went, you first have to understand just how powerful the promise was. During the second half of the 20th century, the West was thirsty for new kinds of spirituality. Suddenly, ancient traditions from the East weren't so distant anymore, and they started to take root. Sogyal Rinpoche, born in Tibet and recognized as the reincarnation of a famous 19th century saint, was in the perfect position to become a guide. He didn't arrive in the West like a remote monk. He was a dynamic, funny, and engaging teacher who spoke fluent English. He could quote ancient Buddhist masters one minute and Western poets the next, making the profound teachings of Dzogchen, the Great Perfection, feel immediate and relevant. He founded his organization Rigpa in 1979, and it exploded into a global phenomenon, proof of his incredible charisma. But the book that made him a global superstar was his 1992 masterpiece, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. This wasn't just a book, it was a cultural event. The Dalai Lama himself wrote the foreword, praising Tibetan traditions with modern thinking. The book's core message was both radical and deeply comforting. If we confront the reality of death, we can finally learn how to truly live. It taught that death isn't an ending to be afraid of, but a transition, an opportunity for a profound spiritual moment. It gave people practical advice on meditation, on compassion, and on how to care for the dying with dignity. In a society that usually hides death away, this was a revolutionary message. The book became a vital resource for hospice workers, doctors, and anyone navigating their own grief or mortality. It sparked a movement inspiring spiritual care programs all over the world. Sogyal Rinpoche became the face of this compassionate revolution. He wasn't just an author, he was seen as a living example of the wisdom he taught. His students revered him. They saw him as their personal gateway to enlightenment, a Rinpoche, a precious one. They committed their lives, their money, and their deepest hopes to him and Rinpoche. They believed they were part of something historic, and they trusted him completely, and for decades that very trust would be the tool used to control and silence them. Whispers about Sogyal Rinpoche had been around for years, but they were easy to ignore. The allegations weren't new. They went as far back as the 1970s. In 1994, a major civil lawsuit was filed against him, alleging that he had used his spiritual power to force a female student into a sexual relationship. The suit was quietly settled out of court, and for the most part, the Rinpoche community just moved on, writing it off as a malicious attack on a great master. But inside the organization, for those in the inner circle, the disturbing behavior wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern. Still, speaking out felt impossible. How do you challenge a man you believe is a living Buddha? How do you question the actions of the person who holds the key to your own enlightenment? For many, the mental conflict was just too much, and staying silent felt like the only option. That all changed in July of 2017. The whispers became a roar. 8 people, not new students but high-ranking devoted members of Rinpoche, put everything on the line. They included directors, a former board member, and Rinpoche's own personal attendants. Together, they wrote a 12-page letter addressed directly to their teacher. It was a document of incredible courage and devastating detail. The letter wasn't a whisper. It was an earthquake that shook the Buddhist world. It began, "As long-time committed and devoted students, we feel compelled to share our deep concerns about your violent and abusive behavior. We can no longer remain silent." The letter was leaked and published online, sending shockwaves across the globe. It laid out in graphic detail what they claimed was a decades-long pattern of horrific abuse. The allegations were brutal. They detailed physical abuse, claiming Rinpoche had punched students, kicked them, and beat them with objects, leaving them bloody and permanently scarred. They did sexual abuse, alleging that Rinpoche manipulated students into sexual acts, using his authority to coerce and control them. They described extreme psychological abuse, terrifying verbal attacks and public humiliations that left students in a constant state of fear. And finally, the letter detailed shocking financial misconduct, describing a lavish and sybaritic lifestyle funded by the donations of his followers, first-class flights, opulent apartments, and an insatiable taste for luxury that stood in stark contrast to the Buddhist ideal of simplicity. This was the turning point. The authors were insiders. They were the people who had served him, protected him, and built his organization. Their collective voice could not be dismissed. The letter broke the veil of secrecy, deception, and deceit, just as they had hoped. The dark truth, hidden for so long, was finally out. So how could a man so revered for his teachings on compassion allegedly get away with such cruelty for so long? The answer isn't simple. It lies in a complex system of psychological control where sacred, spiritual ideas were twisted into weapons of abuse. The foundation of this system was the master-student relationship in Tibetan Buddhism. Students are taught that the guru is the living embodiment of the Buddha's teachings. To get enlightened, you have to have total faith and devotion, a sacred bond called samaya. This bond demands that you see your master's every action as perfect, a direct expression of wisdom. To question the guru is a spiritual failure, a sign of your own impurity. In the hands of an ethical teacher, this is a powerful way to break down the ego. In the hands of a predator, it's the perfect way to break down a person's will. Sogyal Rinpoche's followers were taught again and again to distrust their own gut feelings. One survivor explained it this way: "Our innate wisdom of discernment was lumped in with the term judgmental mind, and we were taught not to trust it. Reacting to our gut feeling that something wasn't right was seen as a mark of a lack of spiritual accomplishment, so we all tried very hard not to react. This created a terrifying closed loop. If you felt that being screamed at or hit was wrong, the problem wasn't the abuse, it was your own spiritual immaturity. The fault was yours. The solution was more devotion, more surrender. This psychological manipulation was even given a name: crazy wisdom. This controversial concept suggests that a truly enlightened master might use shocking or even violent behavior to shatter a student's mind and wake them up. For Sogyal Rinpoche's inner circle, crazy wisdom became the go-to excuse for his alleged violence and cruelty. If he flew into a rage and beat a student, it wasn't anger, it was wrathful compassion, meant to destroy their ego. A student who was once knocked unconscious was later told it was a profound blessing. If he demanded sexual favors, it wasn't exploitation, it was an advanced tantric practice. Women were allegedly told that sleeping with their master would purify their karma. Any resistance was just a sign of spiritual failure. The psychological pressure was immense. Young, vulnerable women were brought into his inner circle, made to feel special and chosen, while being completely isolated and controlled. They were told to lie about their relationships with him, trapping them in a web of secrecy. The physical violence was often done in public, in front of other students. This served two purposes. It terrified the victim into submission and conditioned everyone watching to accept it as normal. It was a form of mass indoctrination. The letter from the 8 students describes a culture where seeing a fellow student get beaten was considered a test of one's own spiritual progress. And this entire system was fueled by a river of cash from followers. Rigpa took in millions in donations, all meant to spread Buddhist teachings. Yet, survivors describe a leader who lived like a king. He had lavish apartments in Paris and London, wore designer clothes, and indulged in fine dining and first-class travel. This, too, was justified with twisted logic. His enjoyment of luxury was just a sign of his enlightened state, beyond any attachment. For the students who had given up their life savings for his vision, the hypocrisy was sickening. The stories you're hearing are tough, I know, but they're essential. Bringing them to light is a huge step towards accountability and healing. If you think this story needs to be heard, please take a moment to support the channel by hitting the like button and sharing this video. It helps this story reach more people. And if you want more deep dives into complex and important topics, consider subscribing. Your support is what makes this work possible. Here's the thing. One person, no matter how charismatic or powerful, can't pull something like this off for nearly 50 years alone. The tragic story of Sogyal Rinpoche is also a story of massive systemic failure. The Rigpa organization and the senior people within it played a key role in enabling and hiding the abuse. They created a culture where the master was protected at any cost. After the bombshell 2017 letter, Rigpa was forced to do something. They commissioned an independent investigation by a British law firm. The final report, released in 2018, was a devastating confirmation for the victims. It concluded that some students had, in fact, been subjected to serious physical, sexual, and emotional abuse by Sogyal Rinpoche. But the report went even deeper, pointing a finger directly at the organization. It found that senior individuals within Rigpa were aware of at least some of these issues and failed to address them, leaving others at risk. This was the critical point. It wasn't just that a revered teacher had a secret dark side, it was that his own leadership knew about it, or had every reason to suspect it, and did nothing to stop it. For years, senior students acted as enablers. They were the gatekeepers. They managed his schedule, his money, and his image. They allegedly selected the young women who would become his attendants. They were the ones who explained away his violent outbursts as a special kind of teaching. Their motives were probably complex. For some, it might have been a twisted form of devotion. Protecting the master was the highest spiritual practice. For others, it was pure fear. To challenge Sogyal meant risking public humiliation and being kicked out of the community that had become their entire world. It meant admitting their whole life's purpose might have been a lie. The UK's Charity Commission later did its own investigation and was even more damning. It found misconduct and mismanagement by the former trustees who had failed to recognize or sought to downplay the seriousness of the allegations. This complicity also went beyond Rigpa. For decades, rumors about Sogyal's behavior circulated among other Buddhist leaders. Some victims had even begged for help, but were often told to just keep their faith. In a stunning public admission after the 2017 letter, even the Dalai Lama, a longtime friend of Rinpoche, acknowledged the failure. He said bluntly, "Sogyal Rinpoche, my very good friend, now he is disgraced." He later admitted he had known about concerns for years and that the system for holding powerful teachers accountable was broken. This widespread failure to act, both inside and outside of Rigpa, shows how hierarchical structures built on unquestioning faith with no real oversight can create the perfect breeding ground for abuse. The victims weren't just failed by one man. They were failed by an entire system that chose to protect a powerful figure over the vulnerable. The 2017 letter and the report that followed triggered a painful but necessary reckoning. The fallout was immediate. In August 2017, just weeks after the letter went public, Sogyal Rinpoche announced his retirement as spiritual director of Rigpa. After 40 years of building a global empire, his reign was over. In a letter to his followers, he acknowledged their hurt, but he never gave a full confession or apology. He wrote, "I am clear in my own mind that I have never, ever acted towards anyone with a motive of selfish gain or harmful intent." For many survivors, this was a final slap in the face, a refusal to take any real responsibility. Riga, the organization, did issue apologies and promised reform. It began the slow, difficult process of trying to rebuild trust and create new safety policies, a process that continues today. But for Sogyal Rinpoche himself, there would be no legal justice. He remained in self-imposed exile in Thailand, where he was being treated for colorectal cancer. On August 28, 2019, Sogyal Rinpoche died from a pulmonary embolism at the age of 72. He never faced a court of law. He never had to answer to his accusers. For his victims, his death brought a complex wave of emotions, but it closed the door on any chance for the final public accountability they deserved. His legacy today is completely fractured. On one hand, you have the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. The book itself is still a source of incredible comfort and wisdom for people. Many readers separate the powerful teachings in the book from the flawed man who wrote it. They argue that the wisdom is pure, even if the person who delivered it was broken. On the other hand, you have the undeniable story of abuse, a legacy of trauma that has scarred hundreds of lives and cast a long shadow over Buddhism in the West. The Sogyal Rinpoche scandal has become a crucial case study in the dangers of unchecked power. It forced a whole generation of Western Buddhists to ask some very uncomfortable questions. It also pointed to a much bigger problem. The Sogyal case isn't unique. In recent years, similar allegations of abuse have rocked other major Buddhist organizations, implicating well-known teachers like Sakyong Mipham of the Shambhala community. This pattern suggests the problem isn't just a few bad apples, but a systemic weakness in communities that treat their leaders as gods and discourage critical thought. It's a textbook example of that old saying, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Spiritual authority isn't immune. In fact, it might be even more vulnerable. When a leader is seen as infallible, all the normal checks and balances just disappear. The story of Sogyal Rinpoche is a story of a deep and disturbing contradiction. A man who brought the light of ancient wisdom to millions, who taught the world about compassion, was the same man who allegedly created a private world of darkness and fear for those who trusted him most. It's easy to just focus on the fallen guru, but to do that is to miss the most important part of this story. The real heroes are the 8 students who wrote that 2017 letter, and the many other survivors who have since come forward. These weren't casual followers. They had dedicated decades of their lives and their hearts to this path. Speaking out meant risking everything: their community, their friends, their spiritual identity, the very way they saw the world. It meant facing public hate from those who stayed loyal. You have to understand what an incredible act of courage that was. They didn't do it for revenge. They did it to protect others. They did it to bring truth to a place that had been filled with lies. They did it to reclaim their own integrity. Their bravery forced a global conversation, making an entire spiritual tradition look in the mirror and face its own shadows. The dark truth behind the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying isn't that Buddha's teachings are wrong, or that the search for meaning is pointless. The truth is that no teacher, no tradition, and no organization is above basic human ethics. The legacy of Sogyal Rinpoche is a painful but vital lesson. True spirituality can never be separated from accountability. It teaches us that the most sacred wisdom we can follow is that inner voice that tells us to question, to think for ourselves, and to never, ever stay silent in the face of abuse. What are your thoughts on this complex story? How can spiritual communities create better safeguards to prevent the abuse of power? Share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. Thank you for watching.